You know, um, following this German election, I've been getting this uneasy feeling the more I read about it. The AfD, this far-right party, they're gaining a lot of traction. It doesn't feel like just a fringe movement anymore. Like what's happening over in Germany?
Yeah, it's a very complex situation. There's a lot going on. But it starts with this upcoming election on February 23rd.
Okay.
And that election was actually called early because Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition government fell apart.
So that's why this feels so sudden.
Exactly.
Okay. But why is the AfD the party that is benefiting from this?
Mm.
What is it that's making them so appealing to voters all of a sudden?
Well, it's a few things. I mean, they're really tapping into a lot of these underlying anxieties that are bubbling up over in Germany,
Okay.
particularly in the eastern regions.
Interesting.
For example, you can look at Alice Weidel, their candidate for chancellor. She recently laid out some pretty bold policy proposals.
Okay.
At a party conference in Riesa, she talked about things like getting rid of wind turbines, reviving that Nord Stream gas pipeline, and really implementing much stricter border controls, including large-scale deportations.
So this is a pretty divisive platform. I can see how that would be appealing to some, especially those who might be concerned about energy or immigration.
Exactly, and that's why the AfD is labeled as this far-right party. They're even classified as a suspected extremist group by Germany's own intelligence agency.
Wow.
But whether or not you agree with them or find them controversial, those policies really resonate with some segments of the electorate, those who feel like maybe they've been overlooked or ignored by the bigger, more mainstream parties.
So they're trying to position themselves as the alternative.
Exactly, hence the name.
Okay. But it sounds like not everyone is buying it, right? There
No.
were huge protests against this AfD conference. What was that about?
Oh, absolutely. Over 10,000 people showed up in Riesa chanting slogans like "No to Nazis," blocking roads, and delaying the start of that AfD event for hours. It was a very powerful display of opposition against everything the AfD stands for.
Wow. That's intense. What were they so fired up about? Was it just about those policies that Weidel announced? Or was there something, a little bit deeper going on?
Well, the policies are definitely part of it, but it goes a bit deeper. The protesters are really worried about some of the rhetoric that the AfD has been using, particularly this idea of remigration.
Remigration.
Yeah, they want to send immigrants back to their, countries of origin.
Okay.
And that's sending chills down a lot of people's spines.
Yeah, I can see why. I mean, that has some pretty dark historical connotations, especially in Germany.
Mhm.
Like they're kind of tapping into this vein of xenophobia and nationalism that a lot of people thought was, long gone.
And that's exactly what's unsettling for so many people about the rise of the AfD. It's not just about their specific policies, it's the underlying ideology, what they represent. For
Mhm.
people who remember Germany's past, this evokes some really uncomfortable parallels.
This remigration concept, can we unpack that a little bit more?
Hmm.
What exactly does it mean, and why are people so concerned about it?
Essentially, it's about reversing immigration, especially for those who aren't of, European descent.
Okay.
And the AfD claims that this is all about preserving German culture and identity, but critics see it as this thinly veiled attempt to scapegoat minorities and fuel racial tensions.
Yeah.
And the term itself, remigration, actually has a loaded history. It's linked to some really awful Nazi-era policies, like the forced displacement of people. So when the AfD uses that term, it's no wonder people are alarmed.
So we've got this far-right party gaining traction, pushing policies and rhetoric that have a lot of people concerned, and we're seeing massive protests in response. Feels like things are really heating up over there.
Yeah.
But how is the AfD actually using this to their advantage? How are they leveraging this?
That's a really good question. One of their tactics is to kind of portray themselves as the victim, as victims of this
Yeah.
intolerant establishment. They point to the protests, to the media scrutiny, and how the other parties try to exclude them from mainstream politics.
Really?
And they're basically saying, look, they're afraid of us because we're telling the truth.
Okay.
They're trying to silence us because we represent the real Germany. This us versus them narrative really plays well with their base and strengthens their support. It makes them feel like they're outsiders fighting against the system.
It's classic populism,
Yeah.
right? Presenting yourself as the voice of the people against this corrupt elite. But it's working. What are the other parties doing to counter this? What are they doing to push back against this narrative?
Yeah, the other parties are in a tough spot trying to figure out how to respond to this AfD wave. It's hard to find that balance. They have to acknowledge those anxieties that are pushing people towards the AfD, the concerns about the economy, about immigration and all that. But at the same time, they can't be seen as agreeing with the AfD's most extreme positions or acting like their rhetoric is normal.
Yeah, it sounds like a really difficult tightrope to walk. So who are the other big names in this election, and how are they handling this challenge?
Besides Weidel, the two biggest names are Friedrich Merz, who's the head of the conservative bloc, and then, of course, we've got the current chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who's trying to get reelected.
Okay.
Merz is running on a platform of economic stability, traditional values, and he's being pretty tough on immigration, probably hoping to win back some of those voters who might be considering the AfD.
So he's trying to, address some of those same issues, but without going as far as the AfD.
Interesting.
What about Schultz? How's he running his campaign?
Scholz is really playing up his experience and how he managed those recent crises like the pandemic, the energy problems, all that. He's trying to seem like a steady and competent leader,
Okay.
hoping that'll appeal to voters who are worried about how radical the AfD is.
Makes sense.
But it's not going to be easy. I mean, his coalition fell apart, which makes him look kind of weak.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think his government just wasn't very effective, all infighting and delays.
So he's got experience, but he's also got some baggage to deal with.
Exactly.
It sounds like both Merz and Schultz are trying to counter the AfD
Yeah.
by addressing those anxieties about the economy, immigration, but they're trying to do it in a more moderate way. Is that going to work? Is that a good approach?
It's really tough to say. It might work for some voters who want an alternative to the AfD but aren't ready to buy into their whole program. But it also risks alienating voters who want to see some really big changes, who feel like the main parties have failed them.
Right.
And it might even end up giving more legitimacy to some of the things the AfD is saying, bringing those issues more into the mainstream.
It's almost like by trying to counter the AfD, they're accidentally spreading their message even further.
Yeah, there's definitely a risk of that. It's like a paradox of extremism. The more you focus on it, even if it's negative attention, the more you risk normalizing it, making it part of what's considered acceptable political discussion.
So the AfD is really shaking things up. Other parties are struggling to figure out how to react. And it feels like there's a lot at stake here. But this is all happening in Germany. Why should our listeners, who might not be German, care about this election? What's the bigger picture here?
That's a really important point. I mean, Germany isn't isolated. It's a huge part of the global economy, a major player on the world stage.
Right.
What happens in Germany affects everyone.
So if the AfD does well in this election, what are some of the global ripple effects we might see?
Well, first of all, the AfD is very nationalistic, very skeptical of the European Union.
Okay.
If they actually get real power, it could really destabilize the EU, weaken European unity. Think about possible trade disruptions, disagreements between countries, maybe even a return of border controls.
Yeah, that would have a huge impact on the global economy. It could really set back international cooperation, and we really need countries to work together on things like climate change.
Absolutely. And a weaker Europe also makes other countries like Russia and China more bold. They might see this as an opportunity to push their own agendas while Europe's distracted and divided. So what happens in this election matters way beyond Germany's borders.
It feels like a major turning point, not just for Germany, but for everyone. Like we're at a crossroads, and whichever way Germany goes will have a big impact on the future.
Yeah, it is a pretty serious thought. But it also reminds us that politics are important, elections have consequences, and we all have a stake in the outcome.
With all that said, what's the main takeaway you want our listeners to think about? What's the key question they should be asking themselves as they watch this German election play out?
The question that keeps coming back to me is, how do we as a global society respond to the rise of these far-right populist movements? What's happening in Germany is just one example of a much bigger trend we're seeing all over the world. We need to understand what's causing this, the anxieties driving these movements, and find ways to address them without resorting to the same divisive rhetoric and policies that are pulling us apart.
That's a huge question, and it's one that's going to be with us for a while. But it also demands our attention. We have to engage with it thoughtfully and be willing to find solutions, even if they're hard and uncomfortable.
Yeah, it really does feel like all the old certainties are crumbling and people are grasping at straws, looking for answers, and sometimes ending up in some pretty scary places.
That's a good way to put it, and it makes you think about why this German election is so important. Germany with its history, with what happened during the Nazi era,
Right.
it really shows where those dark places can lead.
It's like history is trying to warn us, reminding us how fragile democracy really is and how quickly things can fall apart.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what could happen in the long term if
Yeah.
a party like the AfD gets a lot of power, not just in Germany, but anywhere. a country that has had to deal with these kinds of extremist ideologies before.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah. And it feels relevant right now, not just for Germany, but all over the world. We're seeing these echoes of the past, this comeback of nationalism, xenophobia, authoritarianism. It's like we haven't really learned from history.
And that's why we need to pay attention,
Mm.
try to understand what's happening and be willing to talk about these things, even when it's tough. We can't just sit back and think, oh, it can't happen again.
So where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals, as a society, to push back against these trends?
Well, I think it starts with education. Understanding the historical context, recognizing the patterns, the warning signs. We have to be critical of the information we're getting, challenge misinformation and propaganda, support those institutions,
Hmm.
and people who are standing up for democratic values.
It sounds like you're calling us to action, reminding us that we all have a responsibility to protect democracy, the values that we care about.
Definitely. And it's not just about fighting against something, it's about fighting for something, a more just world, a more equitable society where everyone feels valued and respected, where they aren't vulnerable to these ideologies that exploit fear and resentment.
That's a powerful idea and something worth fighting for. We've talked about a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
But it feels like we've only scratched the surface of this really complex and important issue.
It's something that deserves our attention. We have to be open to dialogue, to listening to different viewpoints, to looking for answers, even if they're hard to find.
This has been an eye-opening conversation.
It really has.
And I think we both learned a lot.
Definitely. I hope our listeners did too. This is just the start of the conversation. There's so much more to learn and explore.
So keep those minds curious, stay informed, and keep talking about these things. The future democracy might depend on it.
Mm.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.